The late afternoon light was coming through the kitchen window in long, thin strips, falling across the table where I'd been sitting for the better part of an hour, staring at a cup of tea that had gone cold. Outside, the neighbor's dog was barking at something down the road. Normal sounds. A normal Tuesday. Except that my son-in-law had just stood in my own hallway and told me to sign over the title to my property before the end of the week, or he'd make things very difficult for me. His exact words were, "You're 67 years old, Graham. You can't manage this place on your own. Sign it over now, while we're being nice about it." I didn't say anything. I just looked at him. He took my silence for weakness. Most people do. At first, my name is Graham Whitfield. I was born in Palmerston North, raised just outside of Fielding, and I've lived on the same 12-acre block in the Manawatū for the last 31 years. My late wife Colleen and I bought it together when our daughter Stacy was still in nappies. We planted the macrocarpa hedge along the northern boundary ourselves, one post hole at a time. On a Saturday in August, when the ground was like concrete and our breath came out in clouds. That hedge is taller than the house now. Colleen passed away 4 years ago. Bowel cancer. It was quick. As these things go, 14 months from diagnosis to the end. But there's no version of losing the person you've spent 33 years with that feels quick when you're living through it. Afterwards, I rattled around in the house for a long time. Too long. Probably. Stacy came up from Wellington a few times in the first year, which meant her husband Dylan came too. And I told myself that was what families did, that people circled closer when someone was lost. I wanted to believe that. Dylan Ferris had married Stacy 8 years ago. At the wedding, I'd given a speech about how I was gaining a son, and I'd meant it or I'd wanted to mean it. Dylan was loud in the way of men who feel the room owes them attention, and he had opinions about everything from superannuation policy to the correct way to back a trailer, and he delivered all of them with the same unshakable confidence. But he worked hard, or so I was told, in some kind of commercial property management role in Wellington. What I didn't understand then, what took me far too long to understand, was that Dylan had been looking at my property from the moment he first drove up the long gravel driveway and saw the 2 paddocks, the old implement shed, the house that Colleen and I had put every spare dollar into over 3 decades. He'd been looking at it the way you look at something you intend to eventually own. It started small. Suggestions. Mostly. You should really think about getting a property manager, Graham. Have you had anyone assess the land value recently? Stacy and I have been talking, and we think it might make more sense, financially, if the title were in a family trust. I nodded along. I'm not a stupid man, but grief does something to your judgment. It makes you want to trust the people who are still there, because the alternative is too lonely to sit with. The first time real money was involved was about 18 months after Colleen died. Dylan came to me with a proposition. A mate of his was developing a small subdivision just outside of Palmerston North and needed a short-term investor. $60,000, 6-month turnaround, 12% return. Safe as houses, he said, and then laughed at his own joke. I told him I'd think about it. He rang 3 times in the following week. I withdrew the money from the term deposit. Colleen and I had been building since 1998. And I handed it over. The development fell through. Or so, Dylan told me. I never saw that money again. I want to be clear about something. I'm not a naive man. I'd spent 30 years running beef cattle on this block, dealing with feed merchants and stock agents and local counsel and all the ordinary complications of a working life. I knew people weren't always honest, but Dylan was my daughter's husband. And Stacy, my Stacy, who used to fall asleep on my chest when she was small enough to fit there, stood beside him every time and said nothing. That silence cost me more than the money did. After the $60,000, there were other things. A loan that was never repaid. 44. 73. A piece of farm equipment that Dylan borrowed and returned damaged. And when I raised it, Stacy rang me that evening to tell me I was being unreasonable, that Dylan was under a lot of stress at work, that I needed to think about the big picture. I asked her what the big picture was. She said, "Dad, eventually this place has to go somewhere. You know that. Dylan and I have been trying to plan for the future." I didn't sleep that night. The worst of it came on a Thursday morning in April. I remember the date because it was the anniversary of the day Colleen and I had first looked at this property. Back in 1993, we'd driven up the driveway and she'd grabbed my arm and said, "Graham, this is it." And she'd been right. I'd been out to the far paddock early to check on a heifer that had been off her feed, and when I came back to the house, Dylan's ute was in the yard. He was inside. He'd let himself in with the spare key that I kept under the pot plant by the back door, the one Stacy knew about from childhood. He was standing in the kitchen, going through the papers on my desk, not even pretending to be doing something else, just standing there with a folder open in his hands, reading. I said his name. He looked up without any trace of shame. "Just having a look at the rates notices," he said. "You're behind on the second installment." "Put that down," I said. He put it down, slowly, like he was doing me a favor. Then he leaned against the bench and crossed his arms and told me, in a very reasonable tone of voice, that the time had come to have a serious conversation. He said Stacy was worried about me. He said the property was too much for one person to manage. He said they'd found a retirement village in Lower Hutt. A very nice one, he said. Very modern. And that if I signed the property over to him and Stacy now, as an early inheritance, they'd make sure I was comfortable. He said this like he was offering me something. Like he was being generous. I asked him to leave. He didn't move. He looked at me the way you look at something slightly pathetic. Then he said, "You're 67 years old, Graham. You can't manage this place on your own. Sign it over now." While we're being nice about it. And then he walked past me and out the back door, and I heard his ute start up and go down the gravel, and I sat down at the kitchen table and my tea went cold. I want to tell you what I felt in that moment, because I think it matters. I wasn't panicking. I wasn't even crying. Though the crying would come later, in the dark, when the house was quiet, and I missed Colleen so badly that the missing felt physical, like something pressing on my sternum. What I felt, sitting there, was a very cold and very precise kind of clarity. The sort of clarity that comes when all the small ambiguities finally resolve and you can see exactly what you're dealing with. I picked up the phone and called my solicitor. Peter Hanna had handled our family's legal affairs for 20 years. He'd drawn up Colleen's and my wills. He'd helped us with the title when we extended the boundary in 2006. He'd been at Colleen's funeral and shaken my hand afterwards and meant it. When I told him what had been happening, the 60,000, the loans, the equipment, what Dylan had said that morning, Peter was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Graham, don't sign anything. Don't respond to anything in writing without talking to me first. Come in tomorrow morning and bring everything you have." I brought everything. Bank statements going back 3 years. Text messages I'd had the presence of mind to screenshot. A record I'd been keeping in a notebook, dates, amounts, conversations, not because I'd expected things to go this far, but because Colleen had always told me to write things down. That memory was unreliable when it came to money and family. Peter looked through everything carefully. Then he looked at me over the top of his glasses and said, "You have a case." I didn't tell Stacy what I was doing. I want to be honest about how hard that was. She was my daughter. She was the person I had held in the maternity ward at Palmerston North Hospital when she was 11 minutes old. When she was so small and so impossibly complete that I'd stood there crying and not caring who saw. Every instinct I had said to ring her, to give her the chance to separate herself from what her husband was doing, to let her come back to the side she'd started on. But I thought about the silence. All those times she'd stood beside Dylan while he misled me, borrowed from me, pressured me. The text message she'd sent me the night after the money transfer, telling me not to mention it to anyone, that it was a family matter. She'd known. She'd known about enough of it that her silence was its own kind of choice. So, I said nothing. I went about my days. I checked the heifer, who had recovered and was eating well. I serviced the ride-on mower. I had a cup of tea with my neighbor Bruce, who had farmed the place next door for 40 years and who was the kind of man who said exactly what he thought and never made you feel foolish for asking his opinion. I didn't tell Bruce what was happening, but I think he sensed something, because when I left, he stood at his gate and watched me drive away and raised one hand. And somehow, that small gesture steadied me. 3 weeks passed. Dylan rang twice and I let it go to voicemail. He left messages in a tone that had shifted slightly, still confident, but with something tighter underneath, like a man who has noticed that the response he expected hasn't materialized. The second message said, "Graham, we need to move on this. Ring me back." I saved both messages and sent the recordings to Peter. Then I rang Stacy. She answered on the second ring. I could hear the television in the background, and for a moment, before she spoke, I let myself feel how ordinary that was, my daughter at home on a weeknight, and how much I wished that ordinary was all this was. I told her I wanted to see her. I said I had some things I needed to give her and Dylan, documents I'd been sorting through, and could they come up on Saturday? She said of course, and she sounded relieved, and I knew she thought I was capitulating. I knew she thought the envelope I'd mentioned meant what Dylan had been pushing for. I didn't correct her. They arrived at 10:30 on a gray Saturday morning, Dylan's ute trailing a thin line of dust up the driveway. I watched them from the kitchen window. Dylan got out first, and even from that distance I could see the set of his shoulders, the looseness of a man who believes he's already won. Stacy followed, and she was looking at the house rather than at him, and I wondered what she was thinking, whether she could still see the place the way she'd seen it as a child, whether the macrocarpa hedge still meant anything to her. I met them at the back door. I made them tea, because whatever else was true, I was still who I was. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Dylan had told me to sign over my life, and I asked about their drive up. And Dylan was expansive and easy, talking about traffic on the Otaki Gorge Road, and I listened and nodded and kept my hands steady around my mug. After a while, Dylan said, "So you mentioned documents?" "I did," I said. I got up and went to the kitchen counter where I'd left a plain white envelope, a standard, a 4 envelope, the kind you'd use for anything. I carried it back to the table and set it down in front of Dylan. He looked at it. Then he looked at me, and something shifted in his expression. The looseness tightened just slightly, some animal instinct registering that the room was not what he'd assumed it was. But he reached for the envelope. His fingers were steady. He was too confident to hesitate. He opened it. Inside was not a signed title transfer document. Inside was a formal letter from Peter Hanna's firm, addressed to Dylan Ferris, outlining the summary of events Peter and I had documented over the preceding weeks. It detailed the $60,000. It detailed the loans. It detailed the damaged equipment and the failure to compensate. It detailed the incident in April, the unlawful entry, the papers on the desk, the statement made to me about signing over the property. It referenced Section 228 of the Crimes Act, 1,961 inches, relation to obtaining by deception. It stated that a formal complaint had been laid with the New Zealand police, and that a civil claim for recovery of the debt was being filed in the district court. It advised Dylan to seek independent legal counsel immediately. I watched him read it. He read it the way you watch someone fall in slow motion, and without any ability to stop it. The color went from his face in stages. His jaw set, then released, then set again. His eyes moved back to the top and started again, as though the second reading might change what the words said. When he finally lowered the letter, he looked at me. And for the first time in all the years I'd known him, Dylan Ferris had nothing to say. Stacy had been watching him. When he lowered the letter, she reached across and took it from his hands, and she read it herself. And I watched my daughter's face go through something that I won't pretend was easy to witness. She looked up at me. Her eyes were bright. "Dad," she said. "I know," I said. "I didn't," she started. "You knew about the 60,000, I said, quietly. Not to wound her, but because the truth had to be in the room. You texted me that same night and told me not to mention it." She didn't deny it. She looked down at the letter in her hands, and the silence in that kitchen was the loudest thing I'd heard since the day the hospice nurse had come out of Colleen's room and looked at me in the hallway, and I'd understood from her face what she was about to say. Dylan pushed back his chair. "This is," he started. "I'd sit back down," I said. Something in my voice stopped him. I don't know what it was. I'm not a big man, and I'm 67, and I hadn't raised my voice. But he sat back down. I told them both that Peter had advised me the civil claim was strong, and that the police had indicated the deception matter would be taken seriously given the documentation. I told them that I had no interest in destroying anyone's life. I told Dylan that if he wanted to discuss a repayment arrangement for the 60,000 and the other outstanding amounts, Peter's office was the place to have that conversation, and that any agreement reached would be legally documented and binding. Then I told Stacy that I loved her, that I had always loved her, and that nothing that had happened changed the person she was to me, but that I needed her to understand what she had been part of, and that the path back, if she wanted one, began with honesty. She was crying by then. Dylan was staring at the table. I asked them both to leave, and they did. The following weeks were not easy. Dylan's first response was to engage his own solicitor and push back on everything, claiming the money had been a gift, that I'd misrepresented what had been said in April. Peter had advised me this would happen. Document everything, he'd told me, over and over. And I had. The text messages, the voicemails, the notebook with the dates. When Dylan's solicitor saw the extent of the documentation, the tone shifted. Within 3 weeks, a repayment agreement had been signed, structured over 2 years, legal and enforceable. The police matter took longer. There were statements, interviews, a process that moved at its own pace and couldn't be hurried. I won't pretend it was uncomplicated, but the officer I dealt with was thorough and direct, and she told me at our third meeting that cases like this financial elder abuse within families were more common than most people knew, and that they were taken seriously. What I didn't expect was Stacy. About 6 weeks after that Saturday morning, she rang me on a Sunday night. Dylan wasn't there. She'd asked him to stay at his brother's for a few days, she said, because she needed time to think. She rang and we talked for an hour and 40 minutes, and she told me things I had half known and half refused to know. How the pressure to take the property had begun as Dylan's idea, how she'd told herself it was practical, about the future, about care for me. How she'd suppressed the part of herself that knew it wasn't right because saying so would have meant dismantling the version of her marriage she'd been holding together. I asked her whether she was happy. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Not for a while, Dad. No, we didn't solve everything in that one phone call. There was too much between us for that. And honesty isn't a switch you flip. Once it's a practice. Something you keep doing even when it's uncomfortable." But she came up 2 weekends later, on her own, and we walked the boundary of the property together, along the macrocarpa hedge, and she told me that she'd used to lie in bed as a teenager and listen to the wind in those trees. I told her that her mother had said they'd last 100 years, that the roots went down deeper than you'd think. We walked the whole boundary. It took most of the afternoon. I'm still on this block. The heifer that had been off her feed in April turned out to be pregnant. She calved in late July. A healthy bull calf that I've named Colleen, which my neighbor Bruce thinks is hilarious. The repayments from Dylan arrive on the 1st of each month, transferred electronically, as agreed. I don't know what's happening inside that marriage, and I've decided it's not my business to know. Stacy rings on Sunday evenings, and we talk about ordinary things, which is more than I had 6 months ago. I'm telling this story because I think there are others like me. People who spent their lives building something, not just property, but a family, a way of life, and who found themselves somewhere in the long tunnel of grief or age, or simply the accumulation of trust given too freely, in a position where the thing they'd built was being quietly taken from them by the people they loved. I'm telling it because I spent too long believing that speaking up would cost me more than staying silent already had. There are a few things I've come to understand, sitting here in this kitchen, at the end of all of it. The first is that grief makes you permeable. When Colleen died, I didn't just lose her. I lost the person who had always helped me see clearly, who would have noticed what was happening with Dylan long before I did. Learning to trust your own judgment again, after loss, is its own kind of recovery, and it takes longer than people tell you. The second is that silence is not the same as loyalty. I stayed quiet about Dylan's behavior for a long time because I told myself I was protecting my relationship with Stacy, protecting the family. What I was actually doing was protecting Dylan. The people who benefit from your silence are rarely the ones you're trying to shelter. The third thing is this: write it down. Whatever is happening in your life that doesn't feel right, write it down. Dates, amounts, exact words if you can remember them. Not because you're planning to go to war with anyone, but because documentation is how you protect the truth. Memory is kind and unreliable in equal measure. Paper is neither. The fourth thing, and I think this is the one I'd most want someone to hear, if they're sitting somewhere right now in their own kitchen with their own cold cup of tea, is that being old does not make you powerless. Being soft-spoken does not make you defenseless. Dylan thought my silence that Thursday in April was surrender. It wasn't. It was me deciding very carefully what came next. The law exists for this. Use it. The people who are trained to help solicitors, police, the Office for Senior Citizens, the financial dispute services, they are there because this happens, because it happens often, because someone decided it should not go unanswered. You are not a burden for wanting what is yours. You are not difficult for refusing to be reduced. You built what you built, and it is yours. And there is no age at which you are obliged to hand it over before you are ready. The macrocarpa hedge is tall enough now to hold the sky above the north paddock in a kind of frame, first thing in the morning when the light comes from the east. I noticed that the other day, standing at the kitchen window with a fresh cup of tea. Colleen chose this land. I've tried to be worthy of that choice every year since. I think I still am.